Somewhere I remember the phrase, picture is worth 1,000 words. I think I've saved you about 20 minutes right there. So it gives me a chance to talk about a lot of other aspects of Martin Luther King. I've chosen the title, and sometimes when I choose a title, it's just kind of arbitrary because in reality, there's so many different aspects of his life. But I've chosen that one of the inner life and global vision. And I thought as I got this invitation to come to George Fox that the idea of talking about Martin Luther King's inner life, wow, loudspeaker, and connecting it to his global vision. What do I mean by the inner life? I think when a historian spends as much time as I have looking at the life of Martin Luther King, you begin to see him in two different, somewhat contradictory ways. On the one hand, you begin to understand his humanity. The fact that here is a person who was very, very much aware of his limitations, his flaws, someone who was in some sense an accidental leader. You know, if he had not been in Montgomery when Rosa Parks happened to be in the same place, we might not be talking about Martin Luther King today, and he understood that very, very much. And yet the other side of it kind of takes away from that humanity and looking into his life, looking at him as ML, as Martin, you know, the way he's known in his family and by friends, and instead looking at why we memorialize him. This person who was born in Atlanta in 1929 and because of the Montgomery Bus Boycott came to public notice, rose suddenly to prominence, so that by the end of the boycott, a few months after that, he's on the cover of Time magazine. And that rapid rise, I think, results from his vision. If we go back to look at the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and you know, there's a whole volume of the King Papers based on that. And what is really striking is that it started out with such a modest goal: better treatment under segregation. It wasn't even desegregation of the buses. It was just, if you're going to segregate us and put us at the back of the bus, as Rosa Parks was, don't come on and say we have to get up because a white man gets on the bus. That was the goal, something very modest. Just as often is the case with a social movement. Trying to get a seat at the lunch counter, you know, all of these sorts of things. So in Montgomery, that very modest goal led to a boycott. And I often make the point that Rosa Parks made Martin Luther King possible, not the other way around. That because she was there in Montgomery, he had a chance to display his leadership qualities. The boycott itself started before he was the leader of it. On Monday morning, December 5th, 1955, nearly every black resident of Montgomery stayed off the bus. How did that happen? It happened because black women organized it. Passed out 50,000 leaflets in the black community and got people to stay off the bus. Can you imagine over a weekend organizing a completely successful movement? Come Monday morning, the decision has to be made. Do we continue this boycott? Or is one day going to make the protest and the bus company is going to give in? Well, no one thought that the bus company was going to give in after a one-day boycott. So they have a meeting in the afternoon. And unexpectedly, they turned to this 26-year-old minister who had only been in town for a year. Largely, most historians agree that was because he had only been in town for a year and he didn't have a lot of enemies. And because he was 26 years old and they thought, well, you know, his wife just did have a baby, but he doesn't have a lot of responsibilities, and if someone's going to go to jail or something bad, it might as well be him. And he was uncertain whether he would even accept it, because he had just turned down an offer to head the local chapter of the NAACP. He said, I got enough responsibilities, just arrived in town, just finished my doctoral dissertation. But instead, he decided, I should accept. He didn't call Coretta, by the way. Went home and said, guess what I did this afternoon? And I'll say a few words about Coretta, but this might surprise you, she was an activist before he was an activist. She once told me that, you know, when I met him in Boston in 1952, he had all these ideas about changing the world running around in his head, but he had never done anything. I was the one who was involved in the Progressive Party movement of the 40s. I was the one who had joined the NAACP and engaged in protests. I was the one who was involved in pacifism. She had been protesting against the Cold War. So she, of course, said, yeah, I agree. You should lead this. So he goes home, and he has, according to his later account, about 15, 20 minutes to prepare his speech for the evening rally that's been called. And he knows that this is going to be an important speech, his first time speaking to such a large audience of people who are interested. What's going to happen with this boycott? And he scribbles some things down and goes in that evening and gives what he later describes as the most important speech of his life. And in that speech, toward the end, he says, when the history books of the future are written, they will have to say, there lived a great people here in Montgomery who had the courage to stand up for their rights. Now imagine the audaciousness of that statement. This is a one-day boycott that hasn't even reached the newspapers hardly outside of Montgomery. And he's saying in the history books of the future, they will be talking about this. Interesting. Go to any American history textbook. Certainly anyone that I write, but I think anyone, I think you would agree as a historian that any textbook worthy of its name of American history would mention the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So he was right. Also in that speech, we have in volume 3 of the papers the transcript of everything that happens that night. And before he speaks, other people have kind of laid out the boycott, the organization that's being formed, how they're going to sustain it. All that's been talked about by other people. So he is able to focus on what does it all mean? And what's striking is that he doesn't talk about the immediate goal. Instead, he says, this is not about getting better treatment on the bus. This is about the Declaration of Independence. This is about the Constitution of the United States. This is about the Sermon on the Mount. I'm sure that people in the audience were saying, well, I thought it was about getting better treatment on the bus. And already he is doing something that I think is the essence of Martin Luther King. In the film that save you 20 minutes. I mentioned being at the march. And in a way, he does the same thing there. Many of us thought that the march in 1963 was about passing John F. Kennedy's proposed civil rights legislation, that that's why we were having the march. And most of the speakers that day, that's what they talked about. What was the goal? Getting the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that was the goal. Go back and look at his speech. He doesn't mention the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He doesn't mention Kennedy's proposal. What does he say? No, this is not about civil rights reform. This is about the Constitution of the United States. This is about the Declaration of Independence. You get the idea. What he is doing is saying, I'm here to tell you that this is about something larger than you think it is. That's what a visionary leader does. We all get involved in movements because we want to achieve some immediate goal, whether it's better food in the cafeteria, it could be anything where you think that you're being treated unfairly. And somebody has to do the work of mobilizing that. And often it is people who are unsung. That boycott in Montgomery went on for 381 days. How many of you know a single person who was involved in sustaining a protest for 381 days? Probably not one person in this room. I'm not even sure if I know a lot of the people who were involved in sustaining it. But imagine the work that took. Because you had to find alternative means for maids to get to work. You had to set up a carpool system so that those people who had cars could take people to work in the morning and get them home at night. You know, what as often happened in Montgomery as in other places, black people live in one neighborhood, white people live across town. So sometimes if people have to walk, it could be miles and miles, and 381 days includes a lot of very rainy days, hot days, all kinds of weather. But nonetheless, they sustained it for 381 days. So how does this get back to the theme? Inner life, global vision. We can kind of see the vision. And we can see that that's something that is a constant in Martin Luther King's life. After we get to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we get to that period after that, what is King saying? Go back and look at those speeches, because if he had simply been a civil rights leader, he would have probably retired, maybe become campus minister here, some kind of place where he could get away from it all. But instead, the last 3 years of his life were probably the most active years of his life. I think they definitely were, in terms of, before that, he was kind of episodically involved in things. He was not very much involved in the sit-ins of 1960. He was not involved at all in the Freedom Ride of 1961. He was not very much involved in the voting rights movement of the Deep South that kind of culminated in 1964 and 65. But after 1965, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, you see him moving to Chicago with his family, living in a poor part of Chicago, beginning to mobilize people there. 1966. That's what he's doing during the summer, with living in a one of the poorest areas of Chicago. The following year, what is he doing? He's talking about the Vietnam War. By 67, the end of 67, he's mobilizing the Poor People's Campaign. Amazingly ambitious goals. So what is he telling people? He's telling people that this movement that you've been involved in was not about the passage of 2 pieces of legislation. It was about something much larger than that. It was not about civil rights, it was about human rights on a global level. It was about dealing with issues, by the way, that are still with us today. He was concerned about these broad issues from the beginning. That's why he wrote his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? He was not talking about civil rights legislation. That had already been passed. He was saying, from this point, where do we go? It's a book that I would recommend to you because we still haven't answered this question. Where do we go from here? What do we build on from the civil rights gains of the 1960s? What problems are left undone? What do we do about people who read in the newspaper a new civil rights bill has been passed, but then they look at their lives and see that nothing has changed? I was working at that time in South Central Los Angeles with a group called the Nonviolent Action Committee. The people we were dealing with the day after the Voting Rights Act, their lives did not change one bit. And 1 week later, there was the largest urban rebellion in American history. Obviously, something had not changed. We're still dealing with that question that he's asking, where do we go from here? And I think in some respects, it's complacency. That because we passed civil rights legislation, which was fundamentally important, I think that when we look back and see the changes of those 2 decades after World War II, those were among the most important changes in human history. For the first time, the majority of humanity had basic citizenship rights. Amazing. Before the 60s, most people were subjects, colonial subjects in the world. Most people were second and third class citizens. They were not first class citizens. They were living under apartheid. They were living under other forms of oppression. And by the way, that was true of most women in the world. So something did fundamentally happen. You know, that notion that you cannot be denied your citizenship rights because of reasons of bigotry and prejudice, that's fundamentally important. That hardly any place in the world now do they say, oh, because you're black, you can't exercise your citizenship right. They don't say it openly. That was a fundamentally important change that happened. But he's saying that's not enough. That doesn't change the basic reality of life for many of the world's people. You know, you can be free of colonialism and still be oppressed. You can be free of the Jim Crow system and still be oppressed. There's other problems that we need to deal with. So he was trying to achieve something that we still haven't achieved. Now, that's the global vision. Because he was not simply trying to do that in the United States, he was trying to do that throughout the world. So the other part of the equation in terms of understanding King is how is that related to that human being that I also studied? That person who was not born to be the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but rather simply someone who, when Coretta met him, was a black Baptist minister with some interesting ideas about the social gospel, but not very impressive to her. One thing that's kind of interesting to me is that I've studied their courtship during 1952 and the love letters that he wrote to her. And it's so interesting to see him chasing after her. And she, at first, I mean, she even recounts the details of it, how he called her unexpectedly one evening because she was in her first year at New England Conservatory of Music, and he was in his first year in the Boston University School of Theology. And through a mutual friend, he calls her on the phone and just tries to woo her, talking about, like I'm Napoleon, I'm on my knees, and he tries to invites her to go out to lunch with him. And when she first sees him, how short he is. And and the last thing you can imagine for Coretta was becoming the wife of a Baptist minister. She wasn't Baptist. She was an AME Zion. And she didn't want to be baptized in another church. But she also just could not imagine herself with her idea of one of the things I just remembered. Got to turn this thing off. One of the things that was interesting about her is that she she was mainly interested in him because of her political background, and as she began to talk to him, and he was talking about these social gospel, what the social gospel is this idea that Christianity is mostly about justice, that's the message from the prophets. That's why he's always quoting Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah and all of these prophets that Jesus himself quoted. Do justice to the poor. Do justice to those who are less fortunate. That's a fundamental message. So you can imagine her seeing this Baptist minister talking about all of this stuff. And gradually, she says, as he talked, he grew in stature. And it's so interesting to follow the way their relationship developed, because he was determined that she was his choice. I mean, he tells her on their first date, from everything I know about you, I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife. And he says, you meet all my 4 qualities that I'm looking for in a wife. And if any of you got wooed that way, and you had a notion of your own career, you probably would have run the other way. And she thought about that. But then here was this person who believed very strongly in these ideas that she shared. There's a part in the letters that is also very interesting, because he invites her to come to Atlanta during the summer of 1952 and meet his parents. But he's already told her about how domineering his father is, and how determined his father is that his son should get married, because that's going to help his career as a minister. You can't be single and minister a large church. So she says, no, I don't know if I'm ready to go and meet them. And he gets all upset, and they get into these arguments, and it's all in the letters. And what she does, she sends him a copy of Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward. How many of you in the room are familiar with that book? Not very many. The historian, of course. It should be assigned in school because it's it was a bestseller in the late 19th century. At a time when the United States was going through all these problems of labor strife and the robber barons and all these divisions. Not like today. I mean, so anyway, she sends him this book, which is Looking Backward, and it's about the year 2000 in the United States. And it's this vision of a socialist United States where they have things like free medical care and workers only have to work 8 hours a day. All these things that probably to a 19th century mind, oh no, we'll never be there. And actually, we haven't been there. But in any case, that's why it becomes such a popular book. It's still in print. And so she sends him a copy of this with her inscription. And in one of the crucial love letters, which you can read in the 6th volume of the King Papers, he says it's this mixture of romantic love in which he's saying, I was mad at you, but now I'm getting over it, and our love is so strong that it can't be torn asunder by all of these differences. And then in the middle of it, and then to turn to something more intellectual, he starts talking about Edward Bellamy and his vision. And he says, I guess you know that that's my vision too. And there's a sentence in it that I think gets right to the inner life of Martin Luther King. Because he says, let us work, hope, and pray that we will see a warless world, a better distribution of wealth, and a brotherhood that transcends race or color. That is the gospel I will preach to the world. That's 1952. So what I would suggest is that that's the continuity there. That is the inner impulse that leads Martin Luther King to have his vision that we still haven't fulfilled. That's what he's doing 16 years later when he's leading the Poor People's Campaign. Think of those things, a warless world. He's taken a stand against the Vietnam War. A better distribution of wealth. Well, that's the Poor People's Campaign. And this global brotherhood that transcends race or color. That's the overall context of what he's trying to achieve. So I hope that by looking at it in this way, you can begin to see Martin Luther King as I see him. I see him both as this fallible person who kind of doesn't really expect the prominence he suddenly gains. But once he gets it, he's determined to express what he pledges to Coretta in 1952. That is what he would still be doing today. So I think in conclusion, I would say we need to look at that question. Where do we go from here? A friend of mine, Bob Moses, who was very much involved in the Mississippi voting rights struggle, once made a comment that it stuck with me, and he said, the important word in that question is we. Who is the we? Because until, he said, until we answer that question, who are we going to get to the future with? Is the we all black people? Is the we all Americans? Is the we all people in the world? One thing about democracy is that it's a trust. It's the ultimate trust. Because what you're doing in any democratic situation, whether it's a democratic university, a democratic town, a nation, or the world, is you're saying, I'm willing to entrust my destiny to people I don't know. And that's a high level of trust. I think when we think about our problems as a country, is that for many people that's a step they will not take. It's almost as if you're saying, I kind of believe in that idea of democracy, but I'm going to hedge my bets and take care of my family, my neighborhood, maybe my town, but all those larger visions, I don't know about that. So I think that that's where I would leave you and really say that this is a challenge for particularly those of you who are young. Those of us who, one of the things I notice every time I see that film is, before I met Coretta, I didn't have gray hair. I don't know if I blame her for that, but it's really very clear that we are not going to be the we that creates the future, people my age. It's those of you who are students, those of you who can imagine a better future for this nation and for the world, and are willing to devote yourselves, devote all your talents and energies. And I can't promise, if you do that, that you're going to win. Earlier at dinner, I mentioned the example of W.B. Du Bois. Some of you know that name. He was the founder of the NAACP. He lived to be 95 years old. He was born after the end of the Civil War, so he never saw the victory over slavery. That happened before he was born. He died on the eve of the March on Washington. So he lived 95 years struggling to achieve civil rights reform and never saw it achieved. So you can never guarantee victory. But I am absolutely certain that Martin Luther King and Du Bois and people like him don't regret a moment of it. Because the vision is what makes it worthwhile. The victory is something that is determined by forces beyond your control as an individual. So I hope that particularly those of you who are young and idealistic and thinking about the problems of the world and what can be done, that you will see that Martin Luther King is not that different from you. You are fallible. You have limited abilities. A lot of what you will do with your life are determined by forces beyond your control. But you can make the world better. And sometimes the little victories are important too. So I hope that one thing that we can do is work with each other. So I'm very glad to be here. I'm particularly happy. I had a wonderful drive out here, you've got a beautiful campus. I think Oregon is the place where a lot of Californians are saying, you've got something going here. Unfortunately, you should put up a sign saying, don't come. We've got enough Californians. So thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate being here. Thank you very much.
So let's see if this microphone works. It does. I'm going to take it out of the handle. Dr. Carson has agreed to take some questions. And since we might not be able to hear you, and because we're also recording this, we're going to use this microphone. So you raise your hand, and I will come to you with the microphone, and Dr. Carson will answer questions. So I need a hand.
What? I'm not that
Oh, I got one right here.
I just have a quick question, purely of interest. What were Dr. King's 4 criteria for marrying his wife?
Let's see if I can remember them all. Beauty, and Coretta was a beauty. You just see the pictures of her at that maybe even later. Intelligence, character. He always. That's a word that we don't use as much anymore, but we should revive that word. It's very important. Character. And what was the last? Someone who would you add to that list? What would you add? I don't know. It was humor. I'll probably remember it before we finish all the questions, but she did satisfy the qualities, and I think what was really striking, though, is that he was so determined. I actually know the woman he had dated right before he met Coretta, because she was a colleague of mine at Stanford. She's still around. She's written her own memoir, and she kind of remembers. Their fathers knew each other. And Daddy King called her father and said, my son is going to be at Boston University. Why don't the two of them get together? You can imagine how both of them felt. That this was their fathers arranging them. It didn't work out very well. She said that the times they went out, he invited her to go and watch him preach. And she said, I had to tell him, why don't we go to a movie? So that didn't work. She's still very happily married. Next.
Hi, I've seen a lot of people, including politicians, shutting down protests today, saying that they're not anything like what Martin Luther King Jr. would have, not what he would have wanted. And when we look back at the history, I see a lot of similarity in the protests he was involved in and the protests today. So how do we kind of navigate that and, in a sense, justify ourselves and have them see who Martin Luther King really stood for, like what he really stood for?
Yeah, I do hear that, and those voices were heard when Martin Luther King was around. You know, there's this myth going around that Martin Luther King, when he was alive, was this popular guy. Go back and look at the polls at the time. There was something called the white backlash. Most white Americans did not approve of what he was doing. And they were even more opposed during his last 3 years. But that term, the white backlash, if you did a Google search on it, you'd find that it goes back to like the Birmingham campaign and protests like that. that now are seen as part of American history. I wonder what some of these people, when they talk about that protest needs to be mannerly and all that kind of, have they read anything about the American Revolution? I mean, you know, throwing property into the ocean, you know, they just have little conception that this country was built on a revolution. And they were revolutionaries. If they had lost, they would have all been hanged. So that's our own tradition. And I think that we need to recognize that protest is rarely accepted by those who feel threatened by it. So I think that that's not, there is a concern about protests, and that is, I make a distinction between expressive protest and instrumental protest. Like sometimes you're protesting simply because you're upset with something. And you're trying to express that you're upset. And that happens. You know, like when I read about something in the newspaper that really upsets me, you know, sometimes I want to go out and just shout, you know, not. And other times, though, protest is instrumental. That is, you're trying to achieve a specific goal. And then it's important to kind of say, well, what are the likely consequences of this protest? I may get my anger out, but is this moving toward something that is good, better? And sometimes we don't make those distinctions. I think both are important, by the way. I think sometimes, particularly in the aftermath of something horrible, like I remember when President Nixon invaded Cambodia, you know, at the same time we were thinking that the war in Vietnam was winding down, there was what I would call an expressive protest, the anger. And that's important. You know, when you feel that anger, there should be some outlet for that. But on the other hand, in the end, that didn't end the war. It takes political organizing, sustained kind of activity to make anything good happen in the end. So I don't make a distinction between protest and exercising your citizenship rights. You know, somebody who goes out and protests and then doesn't vote, I just do not take seriously. Because what exactly were you doing that was so important that you didn't bother to go and cast a ballot? Unless you were somehow doing something incredibly important during those hours when the ballot box was open, you have no excuse. Anyway, next question. I think in the person.
I saw this one.
Okay, sure.
Thanks.
Can you talk a little about the Papers Project itself and sorting through all the documents and compiling them into the volumes and maybe something unexpected or different that you found?
Well, you know, I wouldn't be a historian if I didn't get that exciting, that excitement. I had the privilege of going into Coretta's basement, where boxes of documents that had been stored for 30 years in an Atlanta basement were stored, and pulling out things that were crawling sometimes, spiders and things like that. It was my privilege, because I also pulled out a handwritten draft of the acceptance of the Nobel Peace Prize. that makes up for a lot of spiders. So I think that to me is, if you shouldn't be a historian unless that gets to you. That uncovering, if you're an anthropologist, it's digging someplace, I guess. I don't know, I'm not an anthropologist. And I would probably look at that and say, you're just digging in the ground. I mean, it's how, but for a historian, seeing a document that no one has seen, or maybe no one has touched since Martin Luther King touched it. That's really exciting. Now, that's the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg is all those days that are pretty dull. That you're going through a lot of routine material and just trying to catalog it. Right now we have close to 50,000 digitized documents. And we've probably gone through several 100,000 documents. The volumes themselves are the most important 2%. 1 to 2% of all the documents will ever get published. So there's a lot more there. And but we have to, that's why it's called editing. It's choosing which ones are most historically important. Yes, next question. Yes. I'm not giving privilege to people with gray hair, by the way.
Well, I'm gray enough for you. I was a history major at George Fox, and then taught history here for over 25 years. And so I appreciate this school so much, and I appreciate this message this evening, because I lived through so much of what you were talking about. But as we go along on that, I am reminded of the name of this school, George Fox. George Fox was born just about 400 years ago in a place called England, where there were some real frustrations. He spoke out against them, and then had a big vision one day when he said he heard a voice that said, "There is one Christ Jesus who can speak to your condition." And when I heard it, my heart did leap for joy. I'm suggesting to you students here today, as you think about this, that you had a place called George Fox, that you remind yourself of that vision that George Fox had. And you see these problems that we've heard so wonderfully this evening, so horribly as well, but so well spoken. It is your job, like it was George Fox's, to speak out against these, because many of these problems still exist. And I am just crying out to you tonight to be witnesses for Jesus and be witnesses for right answers to these horribly tough problems. And the school that's named after George Fox ought to be the leader in speaking out and overcoming many of these problems that we've heard this evening and exist in our world today.
I think I would add to that, go back and read the letter from Birmingham jail. To some large extent, the letter from Birmingham jail was aimed at Christians who Martin didn't believe were not living up to the ideals. And I think that we have to remember that the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, Their job was to criticize the established religion. That's what they did. That's what prophecy was. If you are not living up to God's expectation in a moral sense, something bad will happen, not just to you, but to all of the people of, in that time, Israel. That's an important message, and it wasn't coming from, for the most parts, the prophets were not priests. They were not rabbis, at least in an official sense. They did not go to school to study to be religious leaders. They were ordinary people, shepherds. They were what we would call working class people. And they were saying that the established religion, those people who are the rabbis, the priests, the pastors of the established churches, that they were failing. That was their message. They were failing to live up to that obligation. One of the things, like probably a lot of you, I grew up in the church and started out as a Baptist. Probably by the high school, I was a Unitarian, and there's only one step further from a Unitarian than not going to church at all. So that's probably what happened. And I think it was studying Martin Luther King that led me to go back and read the Bible. And read it not as, this formula because there are parts of the Bible that were the formula. If you go and read the books of Moses, it's a formula for life, and the vast majority of people, even Jewish, do not follow that formula. But what's important about the prophetic message was it's not the formula, it's the spirit behind it. And if you go through the motions, you're not getting that spirit. And so I think that for me, it's been, to reach your, what was I when I started, about 40 years old, to reach 40 years old and find yourself going back to, let me take a look at that book that I was required to read when I was 12 years old, and that I kind of memorized some of the passages, and take a serious look at it, and what does it mean? And that's an interesting spiritual journey. I think anyone who kind of thinks of religion as answers is missing the point. It's questions. It's the point of the Good Samaritan story is, what is your obligation to the stranger? You find someone in need, and the point of the story is that people of that person's religion passed him by on the road after he had been, wounded by robbers and left by the side of the road. Other Jews passed him by. The Samaritan said, no, I could do that. I could be fearful that the robbers are still around, and maybe I shouldn't stop to help this stranger. But no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take this stranger to a place where it can get some care, pay for that care, leave enough money to make sure that the person gets well. So that to me is the fundamental question of religion. What is our obligation? We know what our obligation is to our kids, some of us, or to the people immediately around us. But we have a world full of strangers, and it gets back to the democratic question. You know, and if we're not willing to help those in need, democracy is not going to work. If you do not care enough about, if someone in this, locked the doors, then you'd have to listen to me forever. If someone locked the doors and said, look, you guys have got to stay in here for the next year. I saw that there's food down the, so you get some food and all that kind of stuff. But you're going to have to live with the people in this room. I guarantee you that we would be very concerned about the mental state of everybody here. And if someone really had strong needs, we would find a way to take care of it. If someone were injured, we would not be asking for their insurance card. We would take care of it. But somehow, the farther out we go, we tend to forget those basic messages. And I think that that's what King is reminding us about, is that we have an obligation to the stranger. We have an obligation to the immigrant. That's what human rights are all about. It's not about whether you have the right passport or the right visa. It's about whether you are a human being made in the image of God. That's it. And if you don't really believe that, I don't know what religion can mean. Because that, to me, is at the heart of it. Anyway, next question. I think maybe just, I know I don't want to keep, what's the...
It's up to you.
Look.
I was ready to cut you off, and then you said...
No, I mean, it's fine with me. You're the one sitting there. I'm the one who I have to go back to my hotel, so. Yes. Let's make it just 3 more questions, okay? And I'll try to answer them briefly.
So I had a question, and being a student and also like wanting to make a change on campus, sometimes it's hard to be able to balance both of those. So my question is, in reading about how Dr. Martin Luther King dealt with trying to balance his life and his work in activism, and even your work in being a student and being an activist, how were you able to balance those and figure out when you should be an activist and when you should be a student? Or
I think I mentioned earlier in the evening, I did it badly at various times in my life. I wrote a memoir about my life, and as I'm writing it, I'm thinking, that was awfully stupid. I mean, you were not balanced. I think the younger you are, the more you tend to kind of go off on a tangent and not really think too far ahead. And that's probably just the nature of being young. I'm glad I did not think too far ahead in terms of the March on Washington, for example. I knew how I was going to get there. I didn't know how I was going to get home. And that was a serious blunder. It meant that I had to hitchhike across the United States. So, and I wouldn't, if my son did that, I would probably, I don't know. But, so a lot of things that you do when you're 19 years old are not meant to be copied. And probably not even written about, because I think I might send the wrong message to the wrong people. But that's if you start a memoir with the notion of being inhibited, then you shouldn't be starting the memoir. Okay.
2 more.
2 more, right there.
Did you have the opportunity of being with Andrew Young very much?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah. He was, as much as I know him, He's Martin's
Well, in
probably
fact,
best friend.
when I taught at Morehouse for about 10 years ago, his office was right down the hall from mine. So got a chance to see him, and I had him come into my class and lecture to the students and things like that.
Yeah.
So.
That's cool. He's a very balanced individual, unusually so, it seems to me.
And we also went to India together to mark the 50th anniversary of King's trip, and we kind of retraced King's trip, which he later described as my pilgrimage to the land of Gandhi. So Andy is a good friend. Yeah. Last question. You got the privilege. Another
Another gray head.
I was not going to say that.
I hope I have some gray matter. First, I want to thank you, sir, for what you have shared with us this evening. I was in seminary with Jim Lawson, and I felt I was not aware of what he was doing in terms of training the sit-ins with students from Fisk University. Yes. I lived in Nashville from 1956 to 59, and during those days, I referred to the fallout among the non-African Americans who lived in the US, because those of us who came from other parts of the world also went through some of the same experiences. So my question is, if you were to write a letter to Dr. King, what are 5 things you would say to him about our world today, about the United States today?
Wow. I wouldn't want the letter to be discouraging, because I think he would be most concerned about the issue of poverty. And in the last presidential campaign, I don't remember in all the debates that the issue of poverty came up. Do you recall anything like that? I don't recall any question about poverty. It's like it's gone away as an issue. War, we've kind of turned that into a permanent, back before any of the young people in this room were born, the Cold War came to an end, and there was talk of the peace dividend and how we wouldn't have to support a huge military anymore. And what happened to that? In the last 25 years, it's like we've adjusted ourselves to the fact that the United States has to have military, and I think what was the count now, some 100 and some nations in the world. And that war is this continuing activity that we have a professional army to do, because most of us who have the ability can keep our sons and daughters out of it. I would favor bringing back the draft. I think that at least if every person has a stake in it, that it could be your kid going off to war, then we would care more about it. So I guess I'll just limit my answer to those 3 things that he mentioned in 1952. A warless world. We have perpetual war. And we have to ask ourselves why. And what is the United States doing about it? Other than, contributing to it. Do we have a better distribution of wealth? I don't think anyone, even those who voted in favor of the tax bill that just passed, even the proponents would not argue that it would bring about a better distribution of wealth. So we just give that up and just say it's inevitable that there's going to be rich and poor, and if we give more to the rich, some of that will get to the poor. And then this brotherhood that transcends race or color. One of the things, and again, I would not want to totally depress him, but it would be of interest to Martin Luther King that in the years since his death, in not a single election has the majority of white Americans voted for the more liberal presidential candidate. It hasn't happened. In the last 13 elections, the majority of white Americans have voted for the Republican Party. So what happened after his death is that there was a massive movement, probably about tens of millions of white Americans resolved never again to vote for the Democrats. You know, Lyndon Johnson in 1964 won by a landslide. In every subsequent election, you know, in the South, it was moving from one party system to another one party system. It just happened that the first one party system was the Democrats. Now it's a one party system for the Republicans. Now, until that begins to change, we're not really going to have a lot of, we'll have what we've had in the last two elections. Swinging from one side to the other side, and there's no in between. So I think that King's notion of this brotherhood that we need to build, we have to begin to say, how do you really build that? How do you start? How do you regain a sense of commonality as Americans, that we can build a nation together? My friend Vincent Harding, when he passed away a few years back, he used to say, we need advanced courses in democracy. Because the notion of democracy and diversity is a very difficult notion. If you have a bunch of homogeneous, if this room were filled with homogeneous people, all of the same religion, all the same race, all the same kind of background, probably we could imagine people would figure out how to live together. But that's not the world. So the challenge we have is how do you build diverse democracies? And you look around the world and you look at the most diverse democracies, India, Brazil, United States, increasingly places like France, countries in Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. They're very diverse countries. Lots of different ethnicities, different religions. They're struggling. So we definitely, people are not born ready to deal with diverse democracies. I think there is in human nature and a distrust of difference. And we need to figure out ways of overcoming that. And the only way of overcoming that is dialogue and the slow process of getting to know each other. The last thing I would say is that in King's book, last book, he talks about the world house. He uses the metaphor of the world house. And it comes from a metaphor he drawn from a novel about people inheriting a house from diverse backgrounds, different religions, different ethnicities. And the question becomes, how do you learn to live together in that house? And he said, that's the question of the modern world. How are we going to, because the house is the earth. And unless Elon Musk can get us all out of here, that's where we're going to stay. And so either we learn to live together, or as Martin Luther King warned, we will die together. Because we have, you know, if to take my metaphor, if this room were, we had to live here a year, and over there was lots of gasoline around the room, and everybody had matches. That's the world. Lots of people with matches. We call them terrorists. Lots of people with matches. They have the ability to blow things up. And so we have to learn that. I mean, the match might be an atomic bomb someday. So we have to learn to live together. And it's a very simple message, but it's going to be a difficult thing to achieve. Thank you very much. Thank you.